In the last episode, Jerry Jones and I started a discussion on privilege and race. Jerry, as you might remember, is a seasoned expat who spent the past decade and a half abroad. In that episode, we unpacked the challenges of recognizing biases when moving globally and explored the cultural blinders that we can have. We also talked extensively about white expat privilege and racism. And our conversation was illuminated by Jerry's experiences navigating both topics as a white father with 2 adopted children of color. If you didn't have a chance to listen to that episode, I want you to encourage you to check it out. In this new episode, we pick up where we left off as our conversation shifts to misconceptions surrounding cross-cultural adoptions and the harmful language that can accompany it. We also take a deeper dive into how to confront others on racial and social justice issues, as well as why it's important to listen to the unheard. As promised, we go deep on this one, but I'm really proud of this conversation. Welcome to the Global Chowder. So I wanted to pick back up, we spent some time talking, particularly because you are raising a Black son who is entering, if he isn't already, his middle school years, which God bless you.
Yeah, right.
But you have a daughter, and we talk a lot about TCKs, which your kids certainly are, third culture kids who've grown up outside of their passport countries and cultures and whatnot. But in the case of your daughter, who's certainly that, she's also a CCK, I would imagine, to a certain degree. And so for her, she, you guys lived in China for most of your expat experience. She was born in China, and you have lived in China. You've lived in China as expats, and by extension, sort of she has. What do you think the differences have been in terms of her experiences being raised by very clearly white American parents?
Yeah.
She has a Black brother, but she looks like the local population, right?
Right.
What do you think's been her story?
Yeah, I think it's been a vastly different experience for her than it has for any of the rest of us. From the time she was a toddler, really, she was 2, almost 3 when we first went to China. And so it's just been a big part of her story to go out and to have that experience of kind of being asked by local people, who are you? And that conversation about that's impossible. The who are your real parents kind of conversation, and navigating also the kind of the different perspectives on adoption. And we're kind of used to that, or getting used to that here in the States. It's a fairly new thing in China. And so having that conversation for people who don't really understand adoption, or they see that as a kind of even turn up the volume on the savior mentality. So, oh, you're such a lucky girl. You've been adopted by these white American people, and there's this sense that she needed saving, or that we somehow came in and rescued her. Which, I mean, that's prevalent enough in this culture, right? Like that's prevalent enough in Western culture that's what we're doing. And I think we saw that with the with the swearing in of the most recent Supreme Court judge, who shared about her family, all of her children, I think 7 kids. And I need to go back and watch it again. But as she introduced her family, like, it was almost sickening. These are my white kids, and they are smart and beautiful and wonderful. And these are my children of color. And they are also smart for children of color and for where they came from. And we really, this is the difference that we have made in their lives. And so, like, that's a narrative that you have to live with when you adopt, especially when you adopt internationally. But then to navigate that from another culture's perspective as well. That's been really challenging, and it's been really challenging for my daughter. And I can't really say with clarity how much of that has shaped her experience, how much of it has shaped her identity, but I know that it's had an impact. She's introverted. She's very introverted by nature. That's who she is. But it's kind of chicken or the egg kind of thing. I mean, is some of that introversion because she's had that experience, or has that experience been changed because of her introversion? It's really hard to say, but it has definitely had an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up something that I hadn't really. Well, I didn't think we were going to go there, but I remember.
Sorry.
There was this. No, that's fine. There was this really big discussion, right?
Yeah.
Around how I keep forgetting her name. Yeah, Supreme Court Justice.
Yep.
Amy Barrett Coney, I think, talked about her children, and I hadn't watched it. I just sort of watched the conversation kind of play out on social media, and I could tell where the conversation was going without even having watched it. That's
right.
kind of scary, but I could tell that particularly that in for folks who are Black, and honestly, it wasn't even folks who were just Black. I think it was other folks who were Indigenous and Asian, and of course, there's been a history of adoption of all these groups. That there was everything ranging from uncomfortableness to just anger in terms of that language being used, and it's so like. And I think it's just so hard for, and I'm going to say particularly white folks, okay?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Who just don't seem to understand why there's an anger and a frustration with the language that's used, right? That it isn't, I mean, you said this perfectly when you talked about having anger towards that man who called out your son, right? And then saying, look, this is a small piece. There's like a 400-year history behind this, right?
Yeah.
And people not understanding that it is I think adoption is a complex thing, right? Particularly when you're adopting children who share a different racial identity than you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the history, and there's some beautiful stories there, and there's some really terrible. I mean, it's I love history. I read history, and I read all the crazy stuff in history. And so, even I think it was a couple of years ago where Belgium was even trying to apologize, for example, to the Congo for mixed race children that they took from their parents.
Right.
And took them to Belgium. Right. Didn't. And so it's all of that backdrop. I think then when you get into, the comments that she made and the reflection of that, and then you extrapolate that into the greater world. And I, we did a story a while ago of a young woman who's of Ethiopian descent. She was adopted by white missionaries, and then her sister they are not biologically related, but they were both Ethiopian. And then there are two siblings after them that are biological to the parents, and just talking about that same conversation you are in terms of the saviorism, right?
Sure.
And what it was like for her to navigate. And so, but I guess I never really thought about it particularly on the flip side. So her being in China,
right?
The reaction, I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I've thought about it, but I think about a lot of things, so I haven't dwelt on it. And
I think that's the richness of this conversation that has come out recently, is that it stirs up a lot of things that a lot of people have never thought of before. And the first response to that is kind of this, shock or get over it or you're overreacting but there's uh, a lot of conversations. There's a lot of heartfelt emotions that we have felt as adoptive parents, as parents raising children of color, as like our specific situation. And everybody's got a specific situation that you can't expect the rest of the world to understand because they haven't had that experience yet. All right. Like their frame of reference hasn't been expanded to that. So when something like this happens, the conversation does come up and it gives the opportunity for us to say some things that people didn't realize before. They didn't realize what it's like to go through those specific things, what it's like for my daughter to be raised looking different than us, but also in a place where most of the people around her look more like her than they do like us. And so it's I love those conversations. I think they're good, but they're not easy because you've got people who haven't yet understood anything about it. And the first response is defensiveness, right? Like that's for any of us, or get over it. And there is this really neat, tidy narrative that comes prepackaged with adoption, where this lovely couple who wanted to have children and for whatever reason didn't, or wanted more children or whatever it is, gets to go in and in building their family gets to rescue somebody from terrible circumstances and it just feeds this sense that in our case, it feeds the sense that, America is better. How lucky they are and how their life would have been so much different had we not come in and rescued them. And we got over that a long time ago. Our daughter rescued us, she completed our family and then it was incomplete again. And we adopted our son and he made it complete. Like we would not be who we were made to be, who we were designed to be without our children. And so in a lot of ways, they are the rescuer and not us. But that's not how the people who are living on the outside of that see it. They get a small taste of that. We've been in more recent years, like we've developed a really great friendship with she's just an amazing friend, but she is a birth mother. And she placed her son for adoption 20 years ago. And she works in that space of helping birth mothers. And it was just like, we adopted, we went and picked our son up from the hospital and there was a whole other side to that story. And it was not beautiful and wonderful in the best day of her life. It was most likely one of the worst days of her life. And so there's all kinds of stories that don't get told in really every situation. But this is ours. And so, yeah, we're excited to have those conversations, but it is hard.
I mean, so I'm curious, how do you, I don't want to use the word pushback because I'm sure in this journey at some point, at least one person has said some variation of that narrative.
Sure.
How do you address that? Like, how do you have that conversation with the folks that's saying, well, there's more to this than just this idea that these children were saved? Yeah.
How do I address it, or what's the right way to address it? Because I feel like those are two different things.
Okay. So the probably more interesting response is, how do you address it? And then what is the appropriate way to address it?
Right. Well, let me answer the appropriate one first. And that's with a simple answer. I don't know. I don't think there's a template for how to do that, because it is, whatever template you have is always going to be filtered through your personality and through your own experience and all of that. I tend to, like, my personality, I'm not super confrontational. I don't love the fight. I do love to drop something shameful and embarrassing in, or like if I can, but it's usually passive aggressive and, I want them to think. And so I'll drop something in that, that maybe makes them, but I don't want it to be a big fight. If I don't think they're ever going to get it, and that's just me making a snap judgment, which is probably wrong. But if I judge in my own heart that these people are just idiots and are not going to be able to get it, I'll just, I'll move on to the next thing, or try to drop some passive aggressive thing in there. I don't think that's the right way to do it. Other people, get very angry and feel like it's their job to fix these people. And I don't know. I think different people do it differently, and I do think that's okay, because I think who we are really matters in this, and how it wouldn't be right for me just to take on a script that somebody else has given me because I feel the pressure to fix the people around me. But at the same time, there is this drive inside of me that doesn't want to let those things go, and does want people to have access to a different story than they've had before. And so I like to get ahead of it. I love to have the conversation when somebody hasn't said something stupid, because I think
right.
then as the people are open to sitting down and listening and hear and being like, oh, I never really thought of it that way. But it's when it gets down to correcting someone, there are a lot of different ways to do that, and I haven't found the right one yet.
So I'm curious because, when we talked about your son, we talked about his identity, and we talked about George Floyd and sort of the things that whole, I don't even want to call it a situation. It was the summer and the fall, and it continues on. But
keeps going.
it just keeps on. It's, the gift that keeps on giving, I guess.
That's right.
But when I think about your daughter, and this actually might be a little bit different because you guys were at that time, you had not left for Malta, so you were in China. But you and I were talking offline, and I mentioned we saw, and it was reported increasingly, across the globe, but particularly in the West, there were more xenophobic attacks and just really harsh language and vitriol and just against folks who had a Southeast Asian identity. We saw that in the US. I know that they were seeing it in Europe in certain places. And so, you had that conversation with your son about George Floyd in terms of how he saw himself. Was there something similar that you saw was happening with your daughter in terms of just the rhetoric? And it wasn't just it wasn't just like the average person, right? Like we were seeing rhetoric coming out of like political leaders and you know what I mean? Governmental institutions that we believe are supposed to be representative and protective of a nation, right? We were seeing that coming from like elite circles. And so I was wondering if there was a similar conversation or thoughts or if anything you guys discussed in terms of how folks who had a Southeast Asian identity were being perceived. And you can even extrapolate that even larger in terms of, how she may perceive her own identity as you guys move beyond China and go into other places.
Right. It's actually really a kind of a refreshing season in her life right now, because she's old enough now to really process and to really kind of look from the outside in and to see what's going on. She's 17 now, and so she's been super interested in the election this year and kind of watching it unfold, but watching it from the balcony, right? Like until the last few weeks, we haven't been right in the middle of it. We were in Malta during the election, and so it was watching from the outside in, and really seeing her brain as a young adult step into this. So it hasn't been that deep emotional, and we even had the cushion of being outside of China for the first time, really in a very long time, but not in the United States yet. And so there was a little bit of cushion, and it's just really fun to watch her, really her adult brain process and make sense of that. We have not yet had the experience because we've only been back in the States for a few weeks. And we've basically been retreating. I mean, we're doing the COVID thing. We're trying to stay out of big crowds and really stay out of the big story, which the world is right now. And maybe that's sheltering us a little bit. So we haven't had that experience where people say stupid things. And I don't know that she's had that experience as an adult. We've had that experience as adults with not necessarily because we have a Chinese daughter, but because we live in China, where you come back into the States and somebody says some really, really stupid China joke, right? Like either mocks the language, tries to, or says something, and then those defenses come up, and it's kind of like, hey, I can pick on my little brother, but you can't. That whole mentality comes up. And so we've had those experiences as adults, and this is her first time. So she's she's got one more year of high school left, and we'll be going into college. And so we're kind of on this watch and see what happens now. And really we want to get her engaged in this culture as much as we can, but we also want to be protective as parents. You know, we don't want to throw her into the stupidest of conversations with people who are ignorant and refuse to admit it. We do want her to be able to unpack that and to maybe shed some light for some other people about what her experience has been and how that has shaped her.
I mean, I think the unfortunate thing is that sometimes you wander into a stupid conversation, not looking for it. It just appears.
Right.
Someone says that
completely.
One thing.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself. I mean, it might actually be one of our superpowers as Americans. That if you wait long enough,
they will come to you.
It will come. Oh,
yeah.
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
Especially sometimes you're not looking for it, and sometimes it's man, I heard you lived in.
Right. Right.
And then it follows. You know, my favorites are, lived in Cameroon. Everyone wants to tell me about the one person from the random African country.
Right. Right.
Oh yeah.
They say something in African.
Right. There's that. Yeah. Do you speak that clicking language? Do you know Swahili? Oh, right. My friend's from Kenya. I'm like, okay, that's like you telling me as an American, your friend's from Chile. I mean, it's a same side of the world, but yeah. 55 plus countries. And so I love the my grandmother gave me just some really good insight. My grandmother was incredibly monocultural, probably pretty racist. That's the preface.
Yeah. I mean, she grew up where she grew up, and she was who she was. And when we told her we were adopting from China, her response was, "Couldn't you get one from America?" Like that nice. And it was just like this. Oh, grandma, like I still love you, but this is a big moment in our life. Thank you for that. And this is how
thank you.
This is how she helped me, is that we adopted Rachel and she loved her. You know, my grandma loved her. And actually she died when Rachel was pretty young, but she was her granddaughter. And then my grandmother, she went to her doctor, who was Asian, was actually Korean. And her doctor, yeah, right. You see it coming. Her doctor had a picture of her daughter up on the wall, and I can't even say it, but my grandma says, "You ain't got nothing on me. I got me one of those little Chinese girls too. She's my granddaughter." And it was like, wow, like, wow, there's so much wrong with that. But that's progress. She moved from couldn't you get one from America to you ain't got nothing on me. And so it's like, you have to give. It is a journey, and it's a long journey, and there are steps along the way, and you have to give people the space to grow in that, and trust that they're going to move forward, and not everyone will quickly. Right. And just because you make a good, solid point about any of these issues doesn't mean that people are going to turn their life around. And like, there's stuff deeply packed in them from the time they were born. It doesn't all come out because they saw something on Facebook that made them think, right?
Right. You saw something on Facebook that made you think. I feel like that's I see stuff on Facebook all the time. Look, Facebook, side rant. I've been on Facebook since the early days. I'm talking, You needed an EDU. I'm talking like 2005. I'm hitting like year 16. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when you can only have been affiliated with the university, and Facebook is just, it's like the cesspool of crazy memes. And I hate memes. If you know me, I actually hate memes. I'm always like, don't send me memes.
Right. Me too.
I will ignore them, whatever. Because it's so easy to take a picture, especially if it's badly photoshopped, and throw on some text. And then, it supports whatever biases you have. But it's interesting you're talking about your grandmother, because maybe my superpower is that I can get the most random people, actually like you, to talk to me about things that maybe they shouldn't say out loud. And I have been shocked, and with the number of white people that I have talked to just in general in my life that have just said stuff that is openly racist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
But don't even like you said, it's so deeply packed in.
Right.
They don't even realize it's racist. And the thing is, they've even said stuff where I think they have forgotten I was black. So they're just saying it
but
because they're
that's
so
what happens.
Comfortable.
Yeah, that's what happens when you have a relationship with somebody. Once you get past that,
you
go deeper into it, and
But I've even had that with people that I'm not even really that comfortable with. But I remember this one time, it was someone at my at an old church who, she had a prayer request that was cool. It was someone a couple years younger than me, and so she said something along the lines of like, I just want to pray for this family, but like, it was something along the lines like, I think it was like a black family that she'd known or whatever, if there was an issue with, but she's like, but they aren't from that other side of the town, right? They're not from that part of that side of town, which was a low income, high need, something. Mm-hmm. It was somehow, there was this association, and I'm not telling the story straight, but there was an association that because they were black, right? Mm-hmm. There's also got to be a low income, high need story there, right? Mm-hmm. And I was looking at her, and I was just thinking to myself, you're telling the story, and you're telling it to me, which means that somehow deep down you have somehow absorbed that if someone has a certain skin color, they must be having a certain type of experience, challenge, or whatnot.
Yeah. And
I'm like, there are a lot of middle-class black people. There are even some rich black people, and just because you see them does not mean you know anything about what they can or cannot do, what they can or cannot pay for.
Right.
And it's just wild to me how you're right, how embedded some ideas we can have that we don't
they
even
are.
think twice.
Yeah.
Even when we're standing in front of someone who's member of a group of which we hold these biases against or these stereotypical ideas. But they're so embedded and so ingrained that people just don't even understand. And,
they are. And yeah.
Yeah. And try to unpack it. Like I just, and I get I've gotten my fair share of, oh, you're not like da 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 da. Or you're not
like the other Black people.
Or you're right. Or you're and it comes in so many different ways, and you know what it is. And and to the Black folks who are listening who've ever been told, oh my gosh, you're so articulate.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
And I'm like, well, why wouldn't I be? I'm really educated. Like, I'm old enough to kind of throw it back in people's faces.
Right.
But I used to get that a lot, especially when I came back as a TCK. I was back in the States. I would get it all the time. Wow, you're really articulate. I'm like, I would hope for all the international schools,
right,
and private schools, and then people look at me like, oh, I'm like, yeah, I don't know what you were thinking, but this is what it is. And so, I mean, I always, the thing I'm very intrigued as someone who's part of at least the majority, which is changing in the United States, is do you find yourself in conversations where people are sort of making these comments and they just sort of assume you are going to go along with them because you present as a white male, and they just assume, I'm very free to say some of the stuff because there aren't any minorities around, or
I think our expat experience has sheltered us from that at some level, but not completely. And certainly, when we come back, when we're and especially in an election year and with all the politics, and it's just, I mean, this is polarized everything, right? And I think, especially because of my heritage, history, background, my faith, and all the demographics and culture that goes with that, there is a lot of times an assumption that I automatically am this thing, or believe these things, or think these things. And so people let their guard down and just have those assumptions. And that was part of the piece that I wrote about my son and George Floyd. Was I really felt a compulsion to get myself out there as, hey, don't put me on this side and automatically assume because of where I've come from. And you would have no reason not to, because that's where I come from. That's the group of people, and probably, and my views, my understanding, my perspective, all of that has shifted throughout this cross-cultural experience. And I'm not the same person that I was when I was younger. And so it would be a mistake for you to think that I'm just an older version of that. And so I want to be very clear. I'm not landing over there. And that was part of me getting out ahead of it. And mostly there was the response to that from the people that I would have anticipated some type of whatever it is. Oh my goodness, or saying something stupid. Mostly the response was silent. It's just, that like, okay, all right. And, that obviously Jerry's not the person we're going to have that conversation with. And I'm thankful for that, honestly.
Silence is a good
thing.
Well,
could we just start this conversation with shut up? All right. Let's just start there. And
I think silence, but here's the thing. I think silence depends on what the scenario is, right? So I think in the scenario that you're in, silence can be a good thing, especially if you're talking with folks who kind of look like you and have maybe a similar background in terms of growing up, whatever. On the flip side, silence can be stifling if you're the minority.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
if you're the one that is the target or the perceived target, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Silence is harmful. Right?
So
In the
harmful.
sense,
Yeah.
if especially if you're someone who may be in agreement or just even wants to be supportive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And you
Right.
don't say anything, because I think what the hard part is, and I think we've seen this summer, and honestly, groups have been saying this from day one, is that, look, if we just look at the United States, if we just look at the Black population in this country is like 13%,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
If every Black person, and this is would never be the case, but if every Black person in this country of adult age agreed, absolutely agreed on all the issues, they still couldn't move it,
Right.
move anything without the support of other groups, without the support of some whites.
Right.
The civil rights movement, I think, is a good example of that. Black folks did a lot of the heavy lifting, right? But there were also other groups that came in and support and put their lives and their bodies on the line. And so you're right. I think that silence is important if it's a conversation between marginalized group and privileged group, silence is good in the sense that if you're willing to listen, which you said, right? Listen, absorb, learn, and kind of do your own work from that.
Yeah.
But then don't just sit in the silence, though.
Absolutely.
When you see bodies are on the line, and then it's like, well, I don't know if I should say something or whatever.
Yeah. And I think, like, I want to be super clear. I wouldn't advocate silence on any of these issues. I think it's really an important time to speak out. And yet the conversation between privileged people, between people who were making the assumption that we're all on the same side and we all agree on these core and oftentimes ridiculous issues. I think absolutely it is our turn to shut up. Like, it is our turn to, we've had our say. We've had plenty to say, and we're still screaming. There's lots of screaming. But this is it's what my son said. It's what my son taught me, right? Like, you can teach me about these things. You can teach me all about history, and you can put all the Facebook memes out there that you want to. You cannot teach me what it feels like to be Black. And I think it is so important for people who come from where I come from to just pause and realize. And so the conversation that I don't want to engage in pointless, meaningless conversations that ignore the realities of suffering and oppression and all of that. I don't want to. That's uncomfortable for me, and it's annoying. And I know these people enough to know that a screaming match with them is not going to move the needle at all for them. It's not going to change anything. However, if there is an opportunity through my experience and from what I've had that they haven't had, my grandmother never got the experience that I had. But my experience did move the needle for her. And so if I can have conversations, if I can write something, if I can say something, if I can do something, if there's anything that can kind of bring them into that first space of just asking a question for the first time when they thought they understood everything, or recognizing and saying, hey, I never really like I did when we met a birth mother, wow, I never really thought about it from that perspective. That's where change begins to happen. And then it's a long journey from there. And those are the conversations that I absolutely want to be involved in. I love those. But I don't want to just sit around with ignorant people who will not admit that they are ignorant. And I don't want to be an ignorant person who doesn't admit that I'm ignorant. So there is a conversation that I long to have, that I kind of pine for. But there's also conversations that to me feel fruitless and meaningless. But other people they take those head on, and I
Yes,
think that's
do.
important too. Right? Like
Yeah.
that's a very important part of this whole thing. It takes
Mhm.
all of that to really see any type of positive change happen.
Well, and I think that, here's the deal. Like, we all need to have some kind of wellness and self-care.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not, I said this in a talk once. I was like, look, here's the deal. You're not going to dismantle hundreds of years of systemic oppression.
No.
You personally in one life. What you're going to do is chip at it. So number one, you need to pace yourself.
Yeah.
And I feel like I was saying that all summer because, there was like this newfound, we're amplifying Black voices and everyone wanted to do DEI work. And I'm like,
Right.
I appreciate your social media efforts. However, you have you have bigger issues than that black square on your Instagram or on your Facebook. I mean, my stuff is still black because I'm me and I don't feel like changing it. And it is what it is on Facebook. But, I think a good example, I've had several educators on, right? Mm-hmm. International educators. We have talked about recruitment practices, right? We've talked about who you've looked for, how you've identified faculty and staff, right, to come into the schools, who you've identified as administrators. Like, I was like, you want to move this conversation into, like, you want to really do stuff. We need to talk at a systemic level, right? Yeah. I mean, there is definitely at the individual level, which you and I do, which we all do, right? Who are passionate about learning from each other's experiences. But then there's the other conversation of systems. And I've said this to folks where you yourself may not be racist, but you yourself may benefit from a racist system.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that when we look at expatriation and we look at some of our expat circles and communities, there are people who are vested in the system being the way it is. Because there are things, it's nice. Do you know what I mean? There are privileges attached to it, right?
Right.
Especially if you were sent by a sending agency. Okay. So business, diplomatic, education, whatever, I could even put in missionary work in that, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
There are massive privileges that are attached to being in these communities. And so to then have a conversation and say, hey, what's been our part? Because, I have used this word far more than I thought I was going to use in 2021. But I was like, we've got some wholesale legacies of colonialism and imperialism.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? Love that.
Yeah. That's good. That's good.
Here's the thing. I've used that and it hasn't really mattered the circle, right? Education, faith, whatever, business. I keep saying. So let's talk about our imperialistic tendencies.
Please.
But it's true though. Like the way we have things set up, the way we recruit, there is a certain, depending on where it is, it's not every community. There is some levels of elitism because there's also a class differential. I think that's why over the past couple of years, we've had this conversation over who gets to be an expat, who gets to be an immigrant.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
So even, I think it's interesting when we talk about you having these conversations, even within your own circle in the US or, with other Americans. But then I think it even becomes even wilder when you try and say, okay, well, how do we, for lack of a better word, disrupt the way things have been to really talk about everyone's experiences and really speak up? Because you as a, I'll just use you as a stand-in, but you as a white male expat may be having a very different experience from a Black male expat who's doing similar work in the same company or organization. But I don't even know if we're getting to the point where we're willing to have that conversation to even say, okay, we could both be American, but that experience your son had, I have that on the regular, in addition to the collective experience that you and I both have as not being part of this culture.
Right. Yeah. So, and there are so many really essential and important conversations to be had. And I think there are so many different approaches and so many different personalities that come to it, and all of those are important, and all of those are a part of this. And I do feel privileged within my own demographic to have had the experience that I have had. If you're just looking at privileged white people, many of them have not had the experience of living overseas and would never want to. I consider that a rich privilege. I consider that something I've had access to that they haven't, and it has shaped me and changed me. And staying out ahead of that and using that experience in whatever way that I can to really help people reconsider the box that they've lived in or the herd that they have run with, I think is a piece, and that's part of my piece of it. And other people are take a much different approach, and I really think that's important too. And all of that is a part of a very, very, very big conversation that we need to be having. But if we're just going to scream and prove our ignorance, I'd rather go have a different conversation.
See, you come with the helpful closing advice. I love how you
and that's me. I want to be clear. That is me. That is not a prescription. It's not a template.
I have to run a disclaimer on your episodes.
Please.
This is just what he does. He's not saying you should do this.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think that's important. You've got to find your place in this conversation. But don't not have it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I think that's the bigger part. I think have the conversation and don't be afraid to have the conversations, but then
absolutely
don't be afraid to maybe figure out a strategy either while you're having those conversations. And
yes. Yeah. Please.
Oh my gosh. I literally could do a whole series with you on just how do we unpack all these different groups that I come across. I mean, you are the intercultural person, so I feel like I'm just going to keep throwing different groups of people at you and going, how do we have this conversation about this?
Yeah, that's why I started with embrace your ignorance, because I knew I would need to come back to that and have that to follow up on later. That's my disclaimer.
That's your full
disclaimer.
There's
so much that I don't understand about this, and I am. I want to learn. I seek to learn, but I don't have answers. I don't have. There's so much more.
Well, I appreciate that you are willing to admit that you don't have answers, and I think that if more of us could do that, we might actually be at a better place if we admit that we're not coming in with the information, but we're willing to listen. And so. Yeah. Well, dude, I'm so glad you've been with me this morning.
This is fun. Yeah.
Always love talking to you about these things and the fact that
Likewise.
You are very unafraid. I don't know how many people I know who are like enter the lair of talking about white privilege with me, but you're very, very unafraid and love the work you're doing. And I follow all your stuff, and so like I mentioned before, we're gonna make sure that your podcast with Chris is in the show notes so that people can follow it and laugh. And as well as, and I don't say that in a bad way. I mean, you will, once again, you will learn
it's okay.
something.
Either way. Why ever you laugh is fine.
It may not be what you thought you wanted to learn. Because I learned a whole lot about Guy Fawkes. But
I did too. Yeah.
I sat there and I'm listening to this episode and I'm in my head imagining the facial expressions that are happening. Because every time I hear a podcast, I'm thinking, I can see Jerry's face of, this is where we're going. I didn't expect him to say that. Learn something new. And so, yeah.
There's always something to learn. Absolutely.
Love it. All right. Till next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. I really, really appreciate you and who you are and what you're doing. I think it's so important, and it's been good for me. You've helped me see from a different perspective, and I'm really appreciative.
Oh, thank you.
The Global Chatter with the Black Expat is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is produced by Justin Williams. You can find the show wherever you get your podcast or follow us on our YouTube channel at The Black Expat Presents.